In the last lesson, we looked at navigating in 3D. Now let's look at creating 3D geometry and manipulating 3D geometry in Nuke. Nuke includes the ability to create several types of geometric primitives as well as editing 3D geometry. So let's look at a basic primitive type here. We'll start with a cylinder. So I've dropped down a cylinder, and you'll see because we're in node selection mode, the overall edit mode for the node turns up when I have this selected. So now when I edit the shape, I'm editing its overall translation and rotation. So this is right in the node that is generating this primitive. There's other aspects or attributes of this primitive that I can edit from its generation node. So for example, if I wanted to reduce the density of this primitive, because it seems to have produced itself quite densely here, and I could increase the density that way, let's say. In this case, if I wanted to close the top and bottom, I could do that. So now I have an enclosed cylinder. So this is how I can edit the cylinder overall and edit some of its parameters. There's other primitives as well, like the cube. And we can also create spheres. And those can all be edited. The primitive generation can be edited from their nodes. And in the case of the cube, you can even edit them interactively using the edges and the corner of the shape itself. So that's how you generate a primitive and edit a primitive. But what if you want to edit the actual geometry? You don't want a sphere anymore. You want, let's say, a bump on the sphere, or you want to pull this cylinder out into something more like a cone. So let's start with the cylinder and edit the cylinder. There's a node called Edit Geometry, Edit Geo, that will allow you to select the primitives, the geometric primitives of this shape, and edit them. And to enable this, you must go into the correct pick mask using this menu here. So I want to edit vertex edits here. I want to do vertex edit, so I'll select that. Now I can lasso a vertex, and as you can see, the edit gnomon shows up, and I can edit that shape or edit that vertex to create the shape I like. So you can use this to create slightly more complex shapes just starting from primitives. Let's edit this a little bit more. I'll go to face selection here, and I'll select some of these faces. I'm holding down Shift and lassoing more faces. And I clicked on that face to edit it, and now I can scoot this whole thing down. And let's say I wanted to scale it. I could hold down Control Shift, and I can scale it this way also. So all the same edit controls work on geometry as would work on the overall geometric primitives. So now I'm editing the geometry directly rather than editing the shape generation. And this is procedural. So if we look at the cylinder, if we view it here, you'll see that none of these edits have actually been applied to this shape yet. They only show up once I've edited the geometry here. So these tweaks all live here. It's also animatable. So if I would like to create a keyframe, I can click the key plus button to create a keyframe. Now I've created a keyframe at 1, and I can move to some other point in the timeline and create another edit. And now that I've created one keyframe, it's all keyframeable, so any edit I make is animatable. So you can even use this to animate edits in geometry if you like. Okay, so let's say you liked the edits that you'd created and you wanted to save them out, not just in Nuke, but you wanted to have a geometry file on disk that you could load into some other package, or that you could bake out and reload back into Nuke. To do that, there is a node called Write Geo. But before we do that, let's get rid of some of these keyframes. I'm going to delete this keyframe, and I'll delete this keyframe here as well by hitting the key plus the minus. Now I don't have animation on this shape anymore. And I'm going to create one more little tweak. Select the vertex again, this little vertex here, and we'll make this more like a cone. There we go. So I'm going to drop down a right geo node. And this will allow me to write this geometry to disk in a number of formats. Let's select a path for it. And I'm going to just use the OBJ format because it's simple and there's no animation in this, so we can get away with the OBJ format. But there's several different formats you can save to. You can do Alembic, ABC format, FBX, and both of these can contain animation, though I would recommend Alembic these days because it's the more modern format. FBX or OBJ. We're just going to save out a static mesh, so OBJ will work fine. And we only want one frame. It should only execute on one frame anyway in this case because there's no frame number padding. I'm going to hit execute. And well, we can just tell it here. We only want it to do one frame. Boom. And it will now have written out a piece of geometry for us. Single, simple geometry file. Now, write geo kind of implies that there must be some sort of read geo node as well. And if you guessed that, you were correct. There is a read geo node. So I'm going to drop down a read geo node so that we can load in some geometry. And you can see by default that none of these shapes that I've created seem to have any shading on them. I'm going to turn on the default lighting in the viewport so that we can see some kind of shading. But really by default, the way that Nuke sets up shapes is that it assumes that you're going to connect an image to them and that you're going to use them as a fully luminous or self-lit piece of geometry to hold a texture. So let's look at a simple example of that. Instead of this skeleton, we'll just go with the cube. So I'm going to view the cube. I'm going to hit F to frame it. There we go. So now the cube is being framed. And I'm just going to connect a simple texture to it. Let's use the color bars. I'm going to connect color bars. And you can see that the color bars map to each side of the cube. It's already got UV maps for each side of the cube in the top and the bottom. And if I was to connect this to any of the other primitives, you would see the same thing. It's just going to map this on very simply on the UVs. In the case of the sphere, it's got UVs that wrap all the way around it. And in the case of the cylinder, the same thing. It just wraps the UVs all the way around the cylinder. So right out of the box, these primitives have UVs. And if you bring in geometry, like the skeleton here, that has UVs, Nuke will know how to properly apply a texture if you attach a texture. So let's attach a color wheel to this one. And you'll see that even if it's got transparency, it will map the transparency to the transparency of the polygons. So this color wheel has transparency on the edges here. Only the wheel has a solid alpha. And you can see on the skeleton here that any place that's intersecting, he's got UV maps that are mapping it on. So let's drop down a regular transform here. I hit T, and I'm just going to adjust the scale overall. And as you can see, as this scales up in 2D in the UV space, it is scaling and covering more of the skeleton, and the transparency is also mapping straight to the skeleton. So you can do some interesting things just using UV maps and transparency and 2D transforms upstream of the geometry. As you can see in this case, you could use it almost by laying out your UVs correctly to create a draw-on effect of geometry or something like that. And this is just with a completely static mesh. I'm going to turn off the GL lighting just so that we can see what this looks like without the GL lighting. This is how Nuke would render it if we were to render it now. It would just render it as a fully luminous or self-illuminated object. And let's set up a simple scanline render so that we can see that. So I'm going to create a camera first so that we have something to photograph this with. And I'm going to create a scanline render node. And I don't have a scene, but I do have a simple object. I'll connect that, and I'll connect the camera here. And I'd like to define the resolution of my render to be something different from my scene setting. So I'm going to connect the background to this and set the format for my render to be, let's say 720p. Okay, so let's look through this camera here, camera 1, and we need to position this so that it is framing the skeleton. If I would like to edit the camera while looking through it, remember, I need to hold down Control and click this button so that it turns green. So now when I edit in the viewport, I'm actually editing the camera, not just the view. I'm pushing the camera around as I edit here. Let's just kind of frame up our skeleton. Actually want to look at his head a little bit more here, so we'll frame up his skull. There we go. And now I'm going to look through the scanline render so we can see it rendered. Hitting 1 and then tab. And as you can see, right out of the box, there's no shading if you attach a texture to a 3D object in Nuke. It will just pass the texture straight through, mapped onto the UV coordinates of that geometry. So what if you do want shading? Well, Nuke actually does come with some shaders, some simple shaders that the scanline renderer knows about. So let's drop one of those down. This is the 3D menu here in Nuke, the cube, the solid cube, and it's got a host of shaders. This one here, the basic material, is essentially like the closest thing that it has to an Uber material. It has specular, diffuse shading and constant shading. So if you are in doubt, this is a good material to apply, just the basic material. So I'm dropping down a basic material, and to use it, you connect it to the image input of the geometry you want to apply it to. So I'm not going to use this texture for now. We're just going to apply this basic material. Now you see, we're not getting any render, and that is because we have no lights in our scene at all. We need to now upgrade our simple setup here, and I'm going to create a scene node so that I can connect in some geometry, but that I can also connect in a light. So I'm also going to have to drop down a light. Nuke only has one node for lights, but that one node can create different types of lights. So if you look here in the light type, you can create points, which is the default, directional, and spot. I'm going to create a spotlight. I'm going to turn this into a spotlight. And now chances are the spotlight's not shining at our skeleton, so we can't see anything. So I'm going to go back into the 3D view by hitting tab here in the viewport, and I'm going to look through that light. Or let's say I'm going to look through the default view just to figure out where the heck my light is, because I don't actually know where it is right now. I'm going to frame up my skeleton just so I can see it. There's the light sitting at the origin still, and I can kind of move that light into some position here. Let's move them over to screen right, to the left of our skeleton. And I'm going to turn this into spotlight. It's already been turned into a spotlight. You can see there's the cone of the spotlight. It's not pointing at the skeleton. So I'm going to hold down Control and rotate the light so that it's at least pointing at my skeleton. There we go. Now the skeleton has a light pointing at him. So let's go look through the camera again. And there's our skeleton viewed through the camera. I'm going to scoot the camera back just a little bit here so that we can see the skeleton a little bit better. There we go. Now let's look through the scanline render. I'm going to hit 1, connect it to the scanline render, and I'm going to hit tab while hovering over the viewer. There we go. So we have a skeleton, and I don't like that framing. Let's tighten that up a little bit more here. I will scoot that in just a little bit more. There we go. And as of recent versions, Nuke's gained the ability to generate shadows in its lights. So if you go to the shadow tab here, you can see right now the light is kind of shining through his eye socket, and he's not the light's not casting any shadow. If you wanted to, you could turn on shadows for that light, and now Nuke will generate shadows. It's Nuke's 3D system, and I just want to make a caveat now that we're looking at some slightly more advanced features of Nuke's 3D system. In my opinion, it's fairly weak in its shading and shadow ability. These shadows are basic shadow map type shadows, and the quality of them is not very high, and they're not very fast to render. So I would say use this for situations when you need a little bit of 3D stuff, not a lot of 3D stuff, and you don't mind the render time affecting your performance in Nuke. But overall, this is these features are still somewhat simplistic in their implementation compared to a full-blown 3D package, but it's definitely nice to have 3D, a full shading system in your 3D package, even though it's somewhat simplistic. Really what Nuke's 3D system is best for is applying textures to geometry in the more like the simple case that I showed, where you attach the texture directly to the geometry and rendering that through rather than trying to do full shading like this. So now that I've said all that, let's look at the basics of adjusting the material. Right now you can see you can adjust the diffuse color yourself if you like. So I'm going to make him a little bit, let's say we'll make him kind of bluish. Turn up the blue in him. So this is his blue diffuse component. And you can also edit his emission and specular. So right now he's quite shiny, or quite specular, and also pretty dull in his shininess. If you wanted to make him, or pretty shiny I should say, if you wanted to make him more dull, you could do that here by adjusting his min and max shininess. And reducing his specular, let's say, so he's mostly diffuse. And if you wanted to make him be emissive, like in the case that you wanted to mix a little bit of this shading with the texture you were passing through, you can make him emissive, and you can make him emissive any color you want. So all of these, instead of being constant inputs, can also have maps attached to them. So if I wanted to make his specular color the color of the texture that we attached, I could attach that texture to, this is the diffuse amount, I could attach that here, that would be his color. Diffuse color. There we go. And this multiplies with the color that is in that slot. So if you're not careful, you can essentially override the color in his material by adjusting it here. So this becomes, in this case, becomes a slider for the, if you just left it solid like this and adjusted it down, this would become a multiplier on the input that you attach to the input. This input here is the emission. So if you wanted to use it similar to how if you connected it directly to this, you could do that by connecting it to this input instead. And then it will still mix in the diffuse component. And that's one of the things about working in 3D you've got to be respectful of. This is a full shading model now that's attached to this. So if you didn't want any diffuse component, you'd want to turn that all the way down. And if you didn't want any specular component, you'd have to turn that all the way down here. And now it's basically just coming through this emission channel or through this constant channel. Okay, so let's put this back on the diffuse and make sure that there is some diffuse. And we've got a shaded guy. So we can see we have a 3D rendered guy with shadows being cast, but right now the anti-aliasing quality is very low. This is something to be aware of in the scanline render. If you want anti-aliasing, you need to turn it on here. This will do a bit of oversampling to increase the anti-aliasing. And you can also use multi-sample. When you have motion, you can use multi-sample. and that will and increase the sample diameter a little bit, and that will increase the size of the samples. This really only works with multi-sample, but once you've done that, and especially if you have motion, you'll get slightly improved anti-aliasing overall. But as you can see, the render time gets substantially slower, and this is my biggest gripe with Nuke's 3D system. It's very flexible and very rationally thought out, but the renderer itself is incredibly slow, and so in that respect, it's not really ideal for a lot of different situations. Any situation where you have heavy amounts of geometry or anything. It's really more for when you need to use 3D geometry to move textures around. There we go. One static render, scan line rendered with shadow mapped shadows, and as you can see, it took a little while to render there.